We continue Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough, by starting with Timoleon. There's no Greek characters in here, so if I pronounce it wrong. It was for the sake of others that I first commenced writing biographies, but I find myself proceeding and attaching myself to it for my own. The virtues of these great men serving me as a sort of looking-glass in which I may see how to adjust and adorn my own life. Indeed, it can be compared to nothing but daily living and associating together. We receive, as it were, in our inquiry, and entertain each successive guest, view their stature and their qualities, and select from their actions all that is noblest and worthiest to know. Ah, and what greater pleasure can one have? Or what more effective means to one's moral improvement? Democritus tells us we ought to pray that of the phantasms appearing in the circumambient air, such may present themselves to us as are perpetuous, and that we may rather meet with those that are agreeable to our natures and are good than the evil and unfortunate, which is simply introducing into philosophy a doctrine untrue in itself and leading to endless superstitions. My method, on the contrary, is, by the study of history and by the familiarity acquired in writing, to habituate my memory to receive and retain images of the best and worthiest characters. I thus am enabled to free myself from any ignoble, base, or vicious impressions, contracted from the contagion of ill company, that I may be unavoidably engaged in by the remedy of turning my thoughts in a happy and calm temper. To view these noble examples of this kind are those of Timoleon, the Corinthian, and Paulus Amelius, to write whose lives is my present business, men equally famous not only for their virtues but success, insomuch that they have left it doubtful whether they owe their greatest achievements to good fortune or their own prudence and conduct. The affairs of the Syracusans before Timoleon was sent into Sicily were in this posture, after Dion had driven out Dionysius the tyrant. He was slain by treachery, and those that had assisted him in delivering Syracuse were divided among themselves, and thus the city, by a continual change of governors and a train of mischiefs that succeeded each other, became almost abandoned, while the rest of Sicily, part, was now utterly depopulated and desolate through long continuance of war, and most of the cities that had been left standing were in the hands of barbarians and soldiers out of employment that were ready to embrace every turn of government. Now, barbarian basically meaning that they spoke a language that these people didn't understand, or maybe even didn't know what the language was. Such being the state of things, Dionysius takes the opportunity, and in the 10th year of his banishment, by the help of some mercenary troops, he had got together forces out Nasaus, then master of Syracuse, recovers all afresh, and is again settled in his dominion. And as at first he had been strangely deprived of the greatest, most absolute power that ever was, by a very small party, so now, in a yet stranger manner, when an exile and of mean condition, he became the sovereign of those who had ejected him. All, therefore, that remained in Syracuse had to serve under a tyrant, who at best was of an ungentle nature, and exasperated now to a degree of savageness by the late misfortunes and calamities he had suffered, the better and more distinguished citizens having timely retired hence to Hicetas, ruler of Leontines, put themselves under his protection, and chose him for their general in the war. Not that he was much preferable to any open and avowed tyrant, but they had no other sanctuary at present, and it gave them some ground of confidence that he was of a Syracusan family, and had forces able to encounter those of Dionysius. In the meantime, the Carthaginians appeared before Sicily with a great navy, watching when and where they might make a descent upon the island, and terror at this fleet made the Sicilians inclined to send an embassy into Greece to demand succors from the Corinthians, whom they confided in rather than others, not only upon that account of their near kindred and the great benefits they had often received by trusting them, but because Corinth had ever shown herself attached to freedom and averse from tyranny, and had engaged in many noble wars, not for empire or aggrandizement, but for the sole liberty of the Greeks. But Hicetas, who made it the business of his command not so much to deliver the Syracusans from other tyrants as to enslave them to himself, had already entered into some secret conferences with those of Carthage, while in public he commended the design of his Syracusan clients, and dispatched ambassadors from himself together with theirs into Peloponnesus. Not that he really desired any relief to come from there, but in case the Corinthians, as was likely enough on account of the troubles of Greece and occupation at home, should refuse their assistance, hoping then he should be able with less difficulty to dispose and incline things for the Carthaginian interest, and so make use of these foreign pretenders as instruments and auxiliaries for himself, either against the Syracusans or Dionysius, as occasion served. This was discovered a while after, the ambassadors being arrived, and their request known. The Corinthians, who had always a great concern for all their colonies and plantations, but especially for Syracuse, since by good fortune there was nothing to molest them in their own country, bother them. Wrongly, where they were enjoying peace and leisure at that time, readily and with one accord passed a vote for their assistance. And when they were deliberating about the choice of a captain for the expedition, and the magistrates were urging the claims of various aspirants for reputation, one of the crowd stood up, named Timoleon, son of Timodemus, who had long absented himself from public business, and had neither any thoughts of, nor the least pretensions to, an employment of that nature. Some entity or other, it might rather seem, had put it in the man's heart to mention him. Such favor and goodwill on the part of fortune seemed at once to be shown in his election, and to accompany all his following actions, as though it were on purpose to commend his worth and add grace and ornament to his personal virtues. Now, in the Islamic tradition, with Muhammad as prophet, you have the scriptural verses and inspired things that directly refer to certain individuals in the community as being the first ones that it applies to, or the verse came down responding to the situation. These individuals, they're remembered by name and honored as such. Hey, their situation, to deal with their situation. Well, except for the case of those who, did wrong, and, they were cursed by name or cursed otherwise, then, sort of the opposite thing. People do remember, but not as well as the people who remember for the virtue of, hey, this is, to rectify their situation, here's what happened. As regards his parentage, both Timodemus, his father, and his mother, Demariste, were of high rank in the city, and as for himself, he was noted for his love of his country and his gentleness of temper, except in his extreme hatred to tyrants and wicked men. His natural abilities for war were so happily tempered that, while a rare prudence might be seen in all the enterprises of his younger years, an equal courage showed itself in the last exploits of his declining age. He had an elder brother, whose name was Timoleon, who was every way unlike him, being indiscreet and rash, and infected by the suggestions of some friends and foreign soldiers, whom he kept always about him with a passion for absolute power. He seemed to have a certain force and vehemence in all military service, and even to delight in dangers, and thus he took much with the people, and was advanced to the highest charges as a vigorous and effective warrior, in the obtaining of which offices and promotions Timoleon much assisted him, helping to conceal, or at least to extenuate, his errors, embellishing by his praise whatever was commendable in him, and setting off his good qualities to the best advantage. Now, you can encourage the good and truth in people that have flaws without being supportive of the errors. And people need to stop it with this, I voted for the guy, so I have to support him in every... No, you don't. You support him the most by saying, hey, you're going too far. Yes, the common... But we add up. We citizens add up. It happened once in the battle fought by the Corinthians against the forces of Argos and Cleona that Timoleon served among the infantry, when Timotheus, commanding their cavalry, was brought into extreme danger, as his horse, being wounded, fell forward and threw him headlong amidst the enemies, while part of his companions dispersed at once in a panic, and the small number that remained, bearing up against a great multitude, had much ado to maintain any resistance. As soon, therefore, as Timoleon was aware of the accident, he ran hastily into his brother's rescue, and covering the fallen Timotheus with his buckler, after having received abundance of darts and several strokes by the sword upon his body and his armor, he at length, with much difficulty, obliged the enemies to retire, and brought off his brother alive and safe. But when the Corinthians, for fear of losing their city a second time, as they had once before by admitting their allies, made a decree to maintain 400 mercenaries for its security, and gave Timotheus the command over them, he, abandoning all regard to honor and equity, at once proceeded to put into execution his plans for making himself absolute, and bringing the place under his own power, and having cut off many principal citizens, uncondemned and without trial, who were most likely to hinder his designs, he declared himself tyrant of Corinth, a procedure that infinitely afflicted Timoleon, to whom the wickedness of such a brother appeared to be his own reproach and calamity. He undertook to persuade him by reasoning that, desisting from that wild and unhappy ambition, he would bethink himself how he should make the Corinthians some amends, and find out an expedient to remedy and correct the evils he had done them, when his single admonition was rejected and condemned by him. He makes a second attempt, taking with him Escalus, his kinsman, brother to the wife of Timotheus, and a certain diviner that was his friend, whom Theopompus in his history calls Saturus, but Ephorus and Timaeus, mentioned in theirs, by the name of Orthogoras. After a few days, then he returns to his brother with his company, all three of them surrounding and earnestly importuning him upon the same subject, that now at length he would listen to reason, and be of another